There are a lot of lost realms from the early modern era which, when translated into the Victorian era, are like fish out of water. The Duchy of Burgundy and its history is in many ways emblematic of the height of feudalism. Its dissolution in the 15th century was a glimpse into the modern world where nation matters more than feudal contract, and yet, Burgundy is indeed a nation which can return here in Victoria 3. I'm not sure why, but it's there. This video can be considered my glorious return to Victoria 3, as I've been on hiatus for God knows how long from this game. And finally, I'm playing this little country because I do enjoy some cool tags. I've got some continental ambitions for Little Burgundy, but they begin with the Netherlands. I'd argue that the Netherlands are the stronger option over Belgium for the Low Countries, if only because they start with claims on Belgium, and taking that little country isn't very hard. Regardless, let's get into how to play the Netherlands, including defeating France and Belgium, as well as how to turn them into Burgundy for a fun little roleplay. The primary concern for any Dutch playthrough is of course to reunite the Lowlands. That's mostly because, quite frankly, the Netherlands themselves kinda suck. The good stuff is in Wallonia and Flanders. In theory, the Netherlands can use its colonies in Indonesia to get access to important resources like iron, coal, sulfur, and wood, but investing overseas won't produce as much taxable wealth for you as making jobs locally. Our general goal in Victoria 3 is to increase tax revenue without destroying the country through radicalism, so we can use that tax revenue for important things like construction and the army. In the early game, before dividend taxes, most of that tax revenue will come in the form of income tax. Regardless, let's not waste time talking about boring stuff like taxes. Instead, let's do the best opening move any country can do in Vic 3. We're going to wage war with China, and China is going to pay for it. It might seem like the humble Netherlands don't stand a chance against the Tiger of the East, but in reality, we won't be firing a single bullet. The British will do that for us. In pretty much all scenarios, if you start a play in South China, Britain will always be willing to join in for a treaty port in Hong Kong. That means you can pull them in and then add a bunch of war goals of your own, which Britain will enforce for you. I'm going to get a treaty port in Suzhou so I can get some silken dyes, and I'm going to, more importantly, grab war reparations. Chinese money on a country as small as the Netherlands will go very far. Remember that war reparations are based on the income of the war target, and Qing has a massive income on account of all their peasants. Beyond that, I'm also going to troll Britain a bit. Remember, their treaty port is in Hong Kong, and Portugal's is also right next to it. If I liberate Yue, then neither of those treaty ports will function anymore, giving me exclusive access to the Chinese market. This will make some big money once I secure a source of opium to sell, and it will rob the British of that opportunity themselves. Beyond that, opening diplomacy for the Netherlands mostly involves securing good relations with as many great powers as possible in preparation for the upcoming Treaty of London. It's not actually that important that the treaty go our way, but it's a nice bonus if possible. The most important ally we'll want will be Prussia. Some strategies involve joining the Zollverein, which can be very valuable actually, as the Prussian market is pretty great, but for this run, I'll be growing too much to reasonably join the Zollverein since I got pretty lucky with my early conquest of Belgium. In terms of early buildings, I don't really plan to ramp up the economy until we get control of Wallonia, so for now, I'm going to just build up some logging camps. Wood is always valuable and is used in construction, so you can help ease the cost of your construction sectors while also generating some nice profits. My deficit in the spring of 1837 is kind of bad and definitely untenable, but I know that Qing's war operations are coming soon, and with those, the deficit will be completely solved. The next month, in June, the war came to an end with absolutely no participation of my own. Now, the government budget is fat, and I have just one infamy. While infamy is low, that means time is being wasted, and Hanover has just broken free from Britain. To be honest, conquering Hanover is very risky because it will give Prussia a reason to dislike you, but Hanover has some good resources, including oil later in the game. But more importantly, it has population, which can migrate into the Netherlands. In truth, this country is in quite a weak position with its low population, poor local resources. In even further truth though, this conquest of Hanover was pretty unnecessary, since if I wanted iron and coal, I can get it from Indonesia. Of course, the more I build there, the more convoys my port connections will cost, so something can be said for Hanover's value too. One distinct upside of getting into Hanover quickly is that I can make the Confederation of the Rhine if I want, and that would prevent Germany from forming. If you're intending to oppose Germany or Prussia, then getting into Germany quickly can be very valuable. Conveniently, the Prussians had a civil war in February of 1838, which would let me grab an obligation in return for a war that I'll just immediately capitulate. Anyway, the London Conference began during the invasion of Hanover, and unfortunately this conference is pretty much totally random. In some test runs I did, the great powers favored the Dutch claims, and in others, the Belgian claims. In this particular run, they ended up supporting the 24 points. That's the outcome where Belgium releases Limburg as a subject of the Netherlands, which is fine with me. Anyway, Hanover surrendered soon after, and then it went after Sindh. Sindh is of great interest to any country with a treaty port in Qing. Sindh has opium plantations, and it has the Indus River, which adds a throughput bonus to agriculture. This game has just been full of stuff, by the way, as even while I'm explaining how important Sindh is, yet another extremely important event has occurred over in Belgium. You see, Belgium starts the game with guarantees from Britain, France, and Prussia, making invading them basically impossible. That being said, circumventing that isn't super hard. There are three options. Either attack Belgium when all three powers are too busy to protect them, which is exceptionally rare, or attack Belgium while you're fighting alongside the three European giants so they can't join against you, which is also super rare. And finally, you can wait for Belgium to have a revolution and support the revolutionary side. When a revolution annexes a country, the diplomacy that that country had is gone, including guarantees. This can be tricky to pull off because the great powers might still try and help Belgium in a revolution, but I'd say that if the Belgians do end up in a civil war, you have to pounce on it. In my game, Britain did end up supporting Belgium, but the revolutionary Belgian tag was in Flanders, which means the British can't get troops on the front line. They could naval invade, but the AI is pretty bad about pursuing naval invasions for wars that it's not very interested in. Not to mention, all I need to do is occupy Wallonia with my army fast enough that Britain won't think to land any armies. And even if I fail, I have nothing to lose. My point here is that even if a great power joins, if there's no front line and there are no war goals on you, it can't hurt to try and win it, right? Of course, it will harm your attitude with that country, but acquiring Belgium is important enough that it's a reasonable sacrifice. In my particular game, I was lucky enough to see the Belgians put up a pretty weak fight, and to see the British just never attempt a landing. They did blow up a ton of convoys and cause me a headache, but Belgium quickly capitulated to their revolt, and then immediately after, I invaded the new Belgian government to reclaim the glory of a united Netherlands. I even called in Prussia to help, since I made an alliance with them using that obligation I got from their civil war. Belgium can hit harder than it looks because they have access to an immense number of conscripts, but with Prussia's help, it's a relatively easy battle. Anyway, once the war was over, I had successfully brought the Netherlands to a pretty powerful position by just 1841. The power of Wallonia cannot be underestimated, as this state alone can practically carry my economy. Thanks to these conquests, I can also form the United Netherlands as a nation, which will annex Luxembourg and Limburg, alongside giving me some nice new primary cultures. With how acceptance works in the current patch, having more primary cultures is very strong, since now, on national supremacy, I'll have a high tolerance for any French-speaking pops. France is often in turmoil. Art imitates life, I guess. And because of that, they're often looking to migrate out. They'll find good lives here in the United Netherlands. I've entered the Hall of Great Powers around this time, which if you ask me is pretty impressive. I've gone from a relatively middling power in the Netherlands to the lowest GP within just a few years. I'm gonna say here that I got quite lucky with those revolutions. I haven't actually played Vic 3 in a long time, so I don't know if I just got insanely lucky or kind of lucky. However, even if it takes a long time for an opportunity to conquer Belgium, it will eventually come, and it should always be your top goal. It's only natural that a great power should have a power block, so I founded the Alliance of the Hog, a sovereign empire. When it comes to power blocks, I love sovereign empires for both the ability to subjugate members and for the valuable vassalization mandate. I also like trade leagues sometimes, but I generally prefer sovereign empire where possible because their statute gives decree cost reduction. One thing I've inherited in my conquest of Belgium is all their construction sectors, and sometimes I'm a greedy bastard, so I like to keep all my construction, but I've learned since my early days of Vic 3. It's okay to downsize construction, if not doing so would almost certainly bankrupt you. I'm not going to bother getting a positive balance, just a more manageable negative balance. It's important to note that I plan to go laissez-faire later on, and once I do, my debt will be wiped out completely basically. My next step is to actually further the goal of this guide, and that is to become Burgundy. I need autocracy for that. It doesn't have an amazing chance to pass, but it has some, and that means I'm willing to roll the dice. While I'm waiting on that, I'm mostly building up my critical supply chains. I'm getting a huge coal and iron supply going in Wallonia. Wallonia, as a state, has almost every resource you could ever ask for. If you were to drop sulfur and oil in there, it would probably be the best state in-game. I'm also going to put some power block statues in my highly populous states so that the decrees there can be cheaper. Never underestimate the power of decrees, especially on high population states. With all the mines in Wallonia, a resource decree goes unreasonably hard. Anyway, passing autocracy has so far been immensely lucky for me. I promise I am not manipulating the RNG or save scumming or anything, I'm just getting super lucky, as by November of 1844, I've already reached the voting phase of autocracy. After one successful debate, autocracy passed in September of 1845, which changed my country to Burgundy. There's no difference between the United Netherlands and Burgundy beyond the aesthetics. Isn't that red beautiful? Now this run will transition to its second phase. We have to restore the old Duchy of Burgundy and the Kingdom of the Arles and create a greater Burgundy to rival the powers of the Victorian era. The Netherlands, or now Burgundy, is a nation of mercantilist economics at the start of the game. It's all about taking resources from the East Indies and selling them to other markets who will use them for manufacturing. It's time to change that though, and make a move to an industrial economy. If we can keep manufacturing local, we can vastly increase the prosperity of the nation significantly. Before getting to that though, I got this pretty rare revolution event called Reforms at Gunpoint, and it's actually a very good event in most playthroughs. It basically forces through one law to appease the revolutionaries. It also makes 5% of the population more loyal. Now here's the thing. Autocracy is necessary to stay as Burgundy, but also I really want universal suffrage, so I can empower some interest groups. So I'm actually going to take the top option and revert to the United Netherlands, but don't worry, I'll be returning to Burgundy soon enough. I was hoping I'd get a bit more power for the industrialists when I got universal suffrage, but I forgot that it's really wealth voting that gives a lot of clout to them. With universal suffrage, I pretty much just kept the same sort of conservative backwards government, but with farmers too. So I guess this little jaunt into democracy will be very short term. I'm immediately going back to autocracy to restore the beautiful red colors of the realm. I'm also making Hanover a puppet, which isn't hugely consequential, but will give me a little boost in government income. I'll also be making Denmark a protector for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they have some colonies in Africa, which will give me natural interests there as my subject. That's a pretty small thing. The second thing is that I'm allies with Prussia, so they're unlikely to ever attack me or my subjects. I don't want a big scary Germany to form, so if I ensure that Schleswig and Holstein remain under Danish or Dutch control, then that won't happen. You think I'd want Prussia as my ally to get stronger, but really, I want them to be just strong enough to help me against France later, but not so strong as to one day betray me. Another use for little protectorates like these can be to trade for help in other wars. Later on in this video, I'll be trading Denmark away to Russia for help in a very important war, and since I don't really care that much for controlling Denmark, I'm fine to give it up. Anyway, Britain got involved in this little war for Denmark, but they're busy with more important conflicts, so they're kinda just hoping to scare me, I think. I ended up just invading through Schleswig-Holstein with Prussia's help and destroying Denmark with relative ease. The British did add a war goal to take some random subject in Indonesia, and once the war ended, they did actually send some naval invasions my way. Rather than try and fight the Brits, I just gave up that subject out east. I then dealt with a relatively small revolution that wanted to stop the move to autocracy. In past patches, revolts were almost always total run-killing monstrosities, but in these recent new patches, it's pretty chill to just deal with a rebellion, especially when it's only in one state like this. After the rebels were put down, I passed autocracy via a cool event where my king survived an assassination attempt and ended up with a completely illegitimate government, but one with strong enough industrialists that I could finally get working on laissez-faire. It remains the case in today's Victoria 3 that laissez-faire is just kind of insanely strong, so I'll be using it to massively expand the economy. Generally speaking, the power of an economy can be more or less judged by how many construction points it can support without bankruptcy. Right now, before laissez-faire, I've got 70. My GDP is about £13 million. I upped that to 130 points once my wars were all done, since I know I don't need any gold stores for the near future, but you get the idea. Waiting for laws to pass can be quite boring, unfortunately, and I can go do some wars since my infamy is at 0, but I was feeling kinda lazy. Instead, I got some crazy ideas when I saw that Napoleon was an available agitator. Maybe I could get Napoleon in charge of the petite bourgeoisie and then make a republic to get him as head of state, followed by a return to monarchy. Considering Napoleon III is the son of the Napoleonic branch that ruled the Netherlands, it would be strangely appropriate. Unfortunately, Napoleon died later for some unknown reason. Anyway, let's go back to talking about laissez-faire for a moment. Laissez-faire is pretty dependent on your reinvestment, in the sense that in order for the power of laissez-faire to shine through, you need a lot of reinvestment to fund the huge share of construction that the private sector will take over. This is where opium comes in. Opium produces huge profits because the cost of labor is cheap and the cost of the goods itself is high. We've even got a massive Chinese customer base to sell to alongside our own population. One problem with selling opium to the Chinese is just how many convoys you need to do it. One of the weakest parts of trade, broadly, is the cost of moving everything, especially because all convoy costs are government costs. No such thing as private shipping in Victoria 3, I guess. In Sindh specifically, we can use an agriculture decree and the Indus River to stack huge throughput. Throughput on plantations is massive because remember, each point of throughput increases the output and the input of a business by 1%. Well, there are no inputs for growing opium, just the cost of labor. Throughput does not apply to wages, only input goods. So at 65% throughput, it's pure bonus profit for the opium owners, which right now is the government. One interesting quirk about laissez-faire is that there's a short period of time where not everything is yet privatized. You can indeed have some government-owned businesses in laissez-faire simply because it takes in-game time for everything to get bought. In laissez-faire, government dividends go back to reinvestment without any losses to paying aristocrats or capitalists. Indeed, in laissez-faire, government ownership is actually more valuable than in interventionism because you can directly send more profits back to the economy. I know it might be a bit confusing, but basically stacking up a massive pile of opium plantations before going laissez-faire can create a huge amount of reinvestment for a little while until the plantations get privatized, at which point they'll go back to mostly just lining the pockets of aristocrats. Regardless, laissez-faire passed in March of 1853, and with it, our economy will surge massively because I can now make a ton more construction sectors. I ballooned up to 235 construction by 1855, and although my balance is quite negative, it's not a problem because my gold reserves will keep getting restocked by everything getting bought out. All the new jobs these buildings will provide are going to contribute to better wages and standard of living in the country. That means the humble Burgundy may soon become a destination for the migrants of the world. For that reason, it's time to pass racial segregation, so that our collection of accepted pops will drastically increase. That law passed in August of 1856, and my construction also increased by then, up to 280. Again, that deficit looks scary, but it's really no big deal. What is a big deal is that I've got 500,000 Sindhi pops in Gallery, which will be a great source of cheap labor. I made a play to annex Hanover at this point, just because I'd rather directly control them in case somehow Prussia does form the North German Federation. Unfortunately, even subject German nations will join the Federation if it does end up forming. I'm doubtful it will form because I've got control of Denmark, but you never know. I've got 0 infamy anyway, so let's make use of it for something, right? Austria did come to Hanover's side, but they didn't end up sending any troops. The AI really does love to saber rattle and then just leave its allies to die, which I guess does make sense, since Austria probably didn't actually care that much about Hanover's fate. Regardless, I had Prussia on my side, so this was mostly just a useless slaughtering of German lives. I ended up having another rebellion in Friesland, by the way. It was the very same group of liberals, but this time they're upset over the new Burgundian secret police. I finally decided to put a good chunk of infamy towards taking Egypt as a protectorate, since they could act as my source of grain and dyes. I can always trade for silk, dyes, and grain from China using my treaty port, but having a source that's not locked behind trade and convoys would be useful. Although goods traveling overseas do use convoys for port connections, they use way fewer convoys than trade routes. I ended up landing in Sudan, as there was no garrison there, and then working my way up to Cairo. However, I ran into a problem. The Ottomans also declared war to reconquer some states and make Egypt a protectorate for themselves. They reached Cairo before me, and so won the war first, making Egypt their protectorate. I was, at first, disappointed, then reassured, then once again disappointed. My war goal to make Egypt a protectorate changed to a transfer subject goal, so I presumed that I'd still get Egypt if I won the war. This was false, as once I won the war, I could not enforce that war goal. Thus, I took on over 30 infamy and a pretty big chunk of government budget to gain Egyptian war operations. You hate to see it. It was around 1860 that I decided it was time to start my campaign to invade France. I've got enough GDP and enough resources to field an army which can defeat the French, at least with Prussian support anyway. Building up the army will take a while, and I'll also need universities to help me get enough tech to possibly match the French. All of this will be very expensive, but it'll be worthwhile to cut the French down. I only need to inflate the army for one big war, and then I can shrink it back down again later. After amassing over 200 battalions and a completely untenable deficit, I began the war, but to be honest here, I should have waited a bit longer because I absolutely cannot afford to be losing this much money. Regardless, I can't turn back now. The combined Burgundian and Prussian armies will have no choice but to defeat the menace of Europe. Also, before I move on to the next chapter, Napoleon III somehow died, but I don't remember how. Rest assured, the thought of a Burgundy led by Emperor Napoleon has died, but there may yet be more funny memes to be had. In Victoria 3, war is, in my opinion, generally bad unless it's against targets which you can easily defeat. This mostly means attacking unrecognized powers, or at the worst, significantly weaker recognized powers. The truth is that my move to attack France here is motivated by nothing more than roleplay. Were I playing more intelligently, I'd go and conquer all of Africa or something. Maybe I'd take over Indochina and Japan. France is a behemoth of a military power, but it can be defeated. The question is whether defeating it is worth the price of admission. The army gets pretty expensive when it's this big, and this money could have been used to make a ton of profitable buildings. Instead, I'll be throwing it away on killing Frenchmen. There's no better use for money, is there? Anyway, I'm opening up the war with the liberation of Occitania. Starting with your low infamy war goals is good so that other powers don't join against you. If you can, wait to add any high infamy war goals until near the end of the diplomatic play timer. I got Prussia in by just calling them as an ally, and I brought Britain in by giving them Guyana. That state can be kind of nice, but having British support against France will make this war faster and cheaper. Consider how much money I'll be saving by ending the war faster thanks to the Brits. That's worth Guyana, in my opinion. Once I had my allies in the war, I added my true war goals. I'll be taking the French Low Countries because they're a Flemish homeland, and I'll be taking Alsace-Lorraine because it's a very good state with iron and coal. I didn't follow my own advice though, and added those war goals in the middle of the diplomatic play. This motivated Austria to join in. Had I waited, they might not have joined. Regardless, Austria will probably focus their efforts on the Silesian front, so it's not a big deal. It will draw away Prussian forces though. My plan is to sit in defensive positions for a while and let the French get themselves killed against my men, after which I'll counterattack and get to Paris as soon as possible. Sadly, the cost of war adds up quickly. In 1865, I started defaulting even after pausing construction. The war is going my way at least, as we've already advanced into the Low Countries and Alsace-Lorraine, but the longer things go on, the harsher my defaulting modifier will get. Part of me held out hope that the cash reserves in the businesses in my new conquests might have pushed my credit limit high enough to get me out of the defaulting status, so as to avoid a bankruptcy, but the truth is that a bankruptcy is pretty much inevitable at this point. The war carried on until 1866 with over 1 million French casualties and almost 500,000 Burgundian casualties. Truly an immense loss of life, so that 2 states can be conquered and so that South France can be free. Immediately after the war, I disbanded about half of the army and then accepted the bankruptcy. In the past, going bankrupt was much worse than it is in the current patch, although it is still quite bad. On the brighter side, I got public healthcare, and this is especially bright because I'm going to be generating a ton of radicals from this bankruptcy. The healthcare I'm getting, and its raising of my standard of living, will help to at least mitigate that to some extent. That being said, it absolutely will not cancel out the nearly 7 million radicals that have erupted into the nation. My answer to this problem, if I were to make this a more focused guide, would be to simply not fight France, as I mentioned before, but if you're dead set in fighting them, then yeah, it'll cost you a lot of money to do so. At least from this bankruptcy, Burgundy can rise like a phoenix, reborn from the ashes of its cremated soldiers. Anyway, all those radicals inevitably led to a reactionary revolt, which would be scary if not for the help that my buddy Prussia can give. This civil war would definitely be killer if not for our German friends, but at least it would get rid of a lot of radicals. Honestly, sometimes civil wars can be very positive for the country, if only because they eradicate radicalism. Radicals cause turmoil, and turmoil destroys a country, both in the long term via construction malices, and in the short term via tax collection penalties. Better to suffer a revolt than live with turmoil. Unfortunately for me though, Spain joined in on the rebel side, and given that my men are mostly useless because I'm bankrupt, that would mean that a half-hearted Prussia would need to beat Spain and my rebellion, which is not suffering from a bankrupt army penalty. This is where I traded away Denmark to save myself. I gave Russia Denmark, in the hopes that they could shift the war in my favor. Had I not done this, it might have been game over to be honest, therefore it's worth it. The only problem is that by giving away Denmark, I lose control of the Confederation of the Rhine. That will cause me to lose prestige for a little while, but in combination with my bankruptcy, the loss of prestige will actually shoot me down to a minor power. In 1869, the Civil War was coming to an end, but Burgundy was demoted to a minor power. That means my power block is gone, and it's also just horribly embarrassing, really. I was thinking at this point that maybe I could join the Zollverein, but that would prove difficult simply because I'm too good at recovering the nation. The question is, how will we recover? The answer is that we'll have to completely change the very nature of this nation. There's a specter haunting the world, and that specter has come to the Lowlands, where the people suffer under an autocratic monarch who misuses his power to wage meaningless wars. Revolution is coming. As a result of all the backlash against the king's recent wars, an intellectual by the name of Karl Marx has found his ideas getting greater and greater momentum. He's come to the forefront of Burgundian politics as the leader of the trade unions, but without elections, and with the secret police everywhere, his subversive ideology has had trouble gaining ground. Nonetheless, ideology spreads from person to person like a plague, and no amount of suppression can ever truly keep it down. In September of 1870, growing fears of a communist revolution led to immense class hostility between the aristocracy and the workers. There were demands for voting rights for all the people, but the powers that be were unwilling to grant that. They instead drafted a system of voting which prioritized the agency of those with at least some wealth. After all, the government could pretend as if it were giving the people voting, as they asked for, without actually capitulating power to the urban slums. However, it wasn't enough, and the people demanded a plebiscite on the creation of a council republic. Now remember, Burgundy is an autocracy, which means that the voice of the people is rather meaningless. But, given the current administration's bankruptcy, another civil war would not be desirable. A genuine push to pass the Council Republic began, with only the will of the people in favor, and the rest of all the powers in Burgundy opposed. Now look, so far this run has been pretty lucky. You might even say very lucky, but I continue to insist that yes, this was indeed just an immensely lucky playthrough. In September of 1871, I got through the first phase of the Council Republic. I did also have to fight another revolution. Now look, I know I said another revolution would be pretty bad, but in reality, so long as no other powers get involved, I can safely use Prussia to win for me. Anyway, no joke, I got a success again with Council Republic during that war, putting me to the last phase in July, followed by a victory in the revolution. My radicals are back down below 1 million, and I'm also back to great power status, although with a hugely diminished construction capability. The money I was spending on construction has instead gone to holding about 100 battalions, since I've kind of gone all in on defeating the French. The South won the war and founded a new power bloc in this timeline, by the way, despite facing a United States with its full borders. Pretty crazy. Anyway, I got the 28% chance to become a Council Republic in April of 1873, so I passed that law legally in terms of the game. But I'd like to think that Marx went and did some crazy coup or something to pull this off, because quite frankly, it had no right to work so well. Regardless, it's time to actually implement some voting rights, and I'm going for census suffrage using the intelligentsia and armed forces. You see, I wanted to keep Karl Marx in charge, but I just had no legitimacy because I'm still an autocracy. With an intelligentsia and armed forces combo, I can at least pass the law eventually. Later, I swapped out the intelligentsia with the industrialists to really send the legitimacy up. This would make passing the law harder, but at least make it a bit faster. The law did pass in May of 1875, and then I attacked Switzerland. See, I was thinking that grabbing West Switzerland would give me access to Italy and Occitania with relatively little resistance, but then France joined the war and threw a pretty huge wrench into that idea. I hadn't been planning on so quickly going back to war with them, but if my hand is being forced, it shall be forced. I of course called in Prussia, and then the first Dutch election was certified, which saw Karl Marx's party win with an overwhelming majority. He of course got right to work collectivizing all industry, using the very same secret police that previously had worked so hard to eradicate his movement. Sorry to keep bouncing around, but a lot was going on all at once. The war with Switzerland was heating up at this time, and I decided that if I'm going to fight France anyway, I might as well get something for it. I added in war operations from France and the conquest of Franche-Comté alongside Lorraine. These two states are also quite valuable and should weaken France significantly while also strengthening me. I'll also be liberating Algeria, only really because it'll be annoying for the French and their Saharan colonies south of Algeria. I used the same technique as last time to defeat France, although it was much easier this time because Austria wasn't involved. I just sat on the defensive until France ran its manpower out and then counterattacked later. It did take quite a while to run the French out of manpower though. If they were willing to use conscription decrees, they might have actually been able to fight pretty much forever, but the AI isn't so savvy. During the war, I hit 50 million pounds of GDP, which was nice to see. The bankruptcy definitely set the nation back, but it's on the rise again now that the king has been ousted and replaced with a more responsible council of wise men. The only thing I miss is, of course, being Burgundy. I know this video is about how to be Burgundy, but come on, I so rarely play communist countries when I play Victoria 3. If you want to play Burgundy, just do everything I'm doing except for the communism part, and you're good to go. Besides, laissez-faire is better anyway. Anyway, it was around April of 1877 that the counterattack against France began, as the combined Dutch and Prussian forces eventually fought their way through to Paris again. The occupation of Paris inspired Marx towards a new ideology. He had become interested in anarchism. I chose that ideology with the hopes of getting multiculturalism, however, a poorly timed event later will render that possibility moot. With Paris once again occupied, France soon surrendered and left Switzerland to their fate. They lost, of course. This Netherlands is starting to resemble the EU4 borders of Burgundy, kind of, although we'll definitely need more land to complete the transformation. I know we're no longer actually Burgundy, but, you know, let it be. In November of 1878, I passed cooperative ownership and also hit 15 standard of living on average, alongside about 60 million GDP. These are some pretty okay stats for the Netherlands in my opinion, but also, I haven't played Victoria 3 in a while. I'm a bit rusty, so do let me know what you think of my performance here. I'm curious if I'm keeping up with whatever's meta these days. Naturally, my next law reform would be graduated taxation. I could really use the extra income from the dividend taxes, although I'd maybe have been better off using proportional taxation since it more harshly taxes income. But by having a fairer system, I'll be extracting wealth from the rich more than the poor, and therefore helping to raise the overall standard of living. Under cooperative ownership, the pops working in a business make both a wage and a dividend income, so that will also help bring standard of living up, assuming we can keep our businesses profitable. This is, in a way, the trade-off for cooperative ownership. And in capitalism, if the business loses profits, only the already rich capitalists suffer. In communism, everyone suffers if profit goes down. Of course, the vice versa is also true. It can lead to a nation which can rubber band between prosperity and ruin a bit more easily, but overall in Victoria 3, I'd say that it tends to create a pretty high SOL, barring gross mismanagement. Unfortunately, I lost Karl Marx in the Death and Taxes event, which would end my possibility of a multicultural nation. The anarchist movement is way too weak in my nation to possibly give me an anarchist anywhere, so I'll have to either hope for someone else to exile an anarchist, or maybe get a humanitarian or enlightened monarchist. We'll see. Regardless, I continued building up the economy with a particular emphasis on steel, glass, and explosives for my eventual change over to steel construction. As if the Victoria 3 devs were watching me and my great successes, they pulled the plug on me and handed me a game crash. Very unfortunate, but I soldiered on anyway. My focus for the nation reoriented towards migration by this point because I knew that I'd eventually run out of people to employ, and although I could keep on conquering for more pops, conquest was quite expensive compared to willing migration. Outcompeting the United States is tough for migration though, and migration is something of a winner-takes-all system. Looking at Wallonia, I've got a nice minority of Germans building up, likely from Hanover, alongside some new arrivals from Switzerland. The 167,000 peasants there might seem like a lot, but you'd be amazed how quickly those run out once you get a lot more construction going. We'll have to start using labor-saving production methods relatively soon to keep up our growth. I hit 70 million GDP in 1883 and also third place great power, but I've been oscillating between second, third, fourth, and fifth quite a bit, so it's hard to say if I'm really maintaining that status or not. Thanks to the change over to graduated taxation and a bankroll from the Brits in return for help in their war against France, I was able to get my construction points up to 760 by 1884, and with that much construction, I'm getting an extra 10 million or so GDP each year, and I'm quite solidly in second place as a great power now. The British have a massively inflated prestige number in Vic 3, if only because of all their Indian subjects and their huge navy, but I do believe I can eventually reach number 1 with enough time. I finally hit 100 million GDP in August of 1887, which put me neck and neck with the British, but I'm quite sure I'll surpass them, since the AI is much less willing to add construction compared to a player. I also began my proper colonization of Africa at this point. This is mostly for rubber and also just to deny the British access to Africa. I got malaria prevention relatively early thanks to all the universities I built earlier, and used that tech to get most of the best parts of the Congo as soon as possible. I actually reformed my old power block in 1888 finally, but it's a trade league instead of a sovereign empire, and I called it the Rhinish Pact. I prefer sovereign empire usually, but I'll take a trade league. To be honest with you, I didn't pursue the betterment of my block very much this run, and probably should have, but it's alright. I just want the mandate effects for the most part anyway, especially the migration one, as it might allow me to outcompete the Americans. The next major event came in 1892 when I invaded Occitania and Italy, looking to further my Burgundian goals. I did take a bit of a risk in this war though. You see, I was just barely too high on infamy to get all the war goals I wanted, but I wanted a beautiful set of borders more than I wanted security. So after adding all my war goals to take Provence, Rhône, Savoy, and Piedmont, I hit 100.7 infamy. That makes me a pariah, although only briefly. Where once the French Empire menaced Europe with its conquests and wars, there's a new menace rising, and that's the communist Netherlands. Although its pariah status here is brief, we will be reclaiming that position sometime in the future so that we can surpass the British as the most important and powerful nation of the Victorian era. By the way, I haven't actually talked about companies at all this run so far, but I should mention that the Belgian states actually have access to some of the best companies in the game, like the Société Jean Coqueril and the Compagnie du Congo. Beyond those two, I have the basic iron and lead mine company, which is just nice for helping out your iron mines and steel mills, which are foundational to any economy. In January of 1894, the war with Occitania and Sardinia-Piedmont came to an end. However, I accidentally chose to conquer Piedmont for my vassal, the Dutch East Indies. So that's kind of an awkward border. It's okay, we'll fix that later. These borders are, more or less, the borders of both the medieval Kingdom of Burgundy and the early modern Duchy of Burgundy, although we're missing the states of Burgundy and Champagne, which I would say are also part of that duchy. I'm working on getting women's suffrage, by the way, and I want to emphasize how good this law is. Workforce ratio, for a nation like this with relatively low population, is amazing. That 15% extra workforce is stronger than it looks because the way workforce ratio works is that any given pop has a ratio based on their job. I think most of them are 25%, with slaves being 50%, and that's about it. Women's suffrage gives 15% more, but not as a multiplicative multiplier, as an additive multiplier. If you have a pop group of laborers with 1 million people in it, by default, 250,000 of them can be workers, that's 25%. With women's suffrage, that goes up to 400,000, as 25% and 15% make 40%. Combine that with the trade union's solidarity trait, and you can get up to 50%, which is double the base. Solidarity gives 5% workforce ratio and 10% when the interest group is powerful. This has an important effect on standard of living as a whole, because it's not just that you have more workers to make businesses profitable, it's that each pop group will be richer because they have fewer dependents. Remember, if 50% of the pops are working, then 50% of the pops are bringing in a wage and a dividend in communism, and pop wealth is calculated as a whole, not individually. So SOL skyrockets for pops if you can actually provide them the jobs to fill the new workforce. If you can't, then your SOL will actually go down because unemployed pops make no money compared to a dependent which just makes a little bit of money and relies on other workers. Essentially, the logic is that if women are expected to work, then they need to work or else they'll be poor. Anyway, point is, workforce ratio is a powerful modifier. For me, the game really started to slow down at this point though. My computer is pretty weak, so the game runs quite slowly, but don't worry, I'm upgrading soon. Regardless, I'm planning to wrap up this run very soon, since I've gotten about the borders I want. I want to wait for my infamy to go down before attacking France since I do fear pariah status, and I basically just sat around letting my private sector build while waiting. I hit 200 million GDP in 1900, which makes me the #1 GDP in the world, albeit Britain still has more GDP in its power block, and has more prestige of course. About 2 years later, I lost enough infamy to justify invading France for the last couple states I needed to really make the Burgundian borders. Hilariously, the Dutch East Indies sided against me here, which actually was a good thing, as I could add a war goal to conquer Piedmont for cheap in this war. That will fix up my borders nicely. The war went as expected really, just go defensive for a bit, then go offensive afterwards. Once I reached Paris, I got everything I wanted, including Prussia's goal to release Corsica for some reason. Now look at those borders. Aren't they beautiful? Also, check out my colonies in Africa. I've got almost the entire Congo, and that's because I got malaria prevention. It lets you colonize so fast, and I was able to cut the British off very quickly since they didn't have it. In 1906, I'd start making my colonial administrations and using them to extract resources. The only reason I'm doing this is to inflate my SOL, since having colonies tends to drag your average down, and after doing that, I hit 20 average standard of living, which is pretty good, although it could certainly be way higher, especially with communism on. I can get more than 20 average with capitalism, to be honest. I decided at this point that the run has to end, but it has to end with a spectacular victory, right? I saw that Yorkshire had a majority Han population, and that made me laugh quite a bit. Imagining some York accents on a bunch of Chinese people is definitely an image, however, I wanted that state for myself. My plan is to rob England of her best states, which, as of right now, are basically York and the home counties. I'm also going to liberate the Raj and liberate much of China. I went up to 117 infamy for this war, which would lead Austria to come after me, but who cares? I can easily defeat just about anyone with my dominant army. The problem is the British Navy, more than anything. I put my men on the Austrian border to deal with the war quickly. I grabbed some war operations from them, and that's it. The army then came back to the Low Countries at that point to defend against British naval landings, and this is where we more or less hit a stalemate. Britain is destroying my convoys and is trying to land in Holland, but they can't possibly defeat my army and land, nor can my navy realistically break out and land in England. A little bit later though, I had that issue, bug? I'm not sure what it is, but I have an army garrisoned in Holland, and yet Britain is just getting free battles without resistance there, and therefore can just occupy my country. I think this issue has to do with like generals or something, I have no idea. Regardless, I consider this foul play, as the British did indeed land in Holland, but only through what I might dub bullshit. For that, I did swap countries and then make Britain surrender, not because I want to act like I won or anything, I likely would have just eventually wiped peace out of this war, but rather because I wanted to be done with this run by this point. I've been playing for like 12 hours or so. After the war ended, I hit #1 great power since Britain lost a pretty important set of states there, and of course the Raj went free and fractured. So as to not misrepresent how the game went, I did reload to before I swapped over to show you my final stats. My GDP tanked quite a bit with Britain raiding my convoys, and my standard of living also did drop, but it's still some pretty good stats. I estimated that without this war, I'd have hit 300 million GDP in a couple more years and probably hovered around 22 standard of living. Regardless, this video's point is to be a guide for playing the Netherlands, and I think it does a pretty good job at that. It's all about making friends with the great powers and waiting for just the right moment to conquer Belgium. It's not like delaying conquering Belgium is so awful, since any time you spend waiting to conquer that land is time that Belgium will be adding more buildings to it and developing it. You should, in your run, completely ignore fighting any great power and instead just dominate the colonial game. Rush for malaria prevention and get all of Africa. You don't need to conquer Europe just to get the migrant waves by maybe crippling America and increasing your own SOL. Any game where you intend to rely on migration, it will be wise to attack America and force them to release New Africa, as well as helping Mexico defeat them if possible. If you can pull that off, your competition for migrants will be way better. So, this was the Netherlands into Burgundy guide. It's a fun little goal to control the land between Provence and Holland, and it makes for a pretty powerful empire, although most of the value in this empire is right in Belgium, to be honest. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you're looking forward to my return to Victoria 3. Thank you for your time.